Lesson 7 will dive into a fundamental step of bringing our projects to life, turning a zoning plan into a functional floor plan by defining wall partitions and thicknesses. By the end of this lesson, you'll have a good understanding of how to draw walls and add openings in a precise and accurate manner using Rayon. Okay, welcome to lesson number 7. This is where the magic happens. This is where we're going to start turning this zoning plan and our outline massing into an architecture floor plan. And we're also going to explore sections and elevations alongside this floor plan and start to really build this project. Now, the first thing that we're going to do is use the zoning plan once again as a base. So this is the kind of step-by-step process. We have the massing, we then have the zoning, we then draw the walls and create the actual spatial arrangements. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a bit of a cleanup with this because it's there's a bit too much information going on here for a floor plan. So the first thing that I'm going to do is just head into this group and start deleting some of these details that I don't need. We don't need some of this information. We don't need these. We can then change these to just a solid red line. Let's just reduce that right down. And I'm also going to crop the image down so that we've got a bit more manageable space to work with. So I'm going to head down to the bottom of the tab. I'm going to select the rectangle tool, select one point, drag it down, and we're going to define a bit of a zone. And I'm going to right click on the group. I'm going to ungroup it, and I'm just going to begin to trim it down. So coming down to the bottom, once again, using the trim editing tools, I'm going to start trimming the drawing down and start deleting some of this information that we don't require. And then the final thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to rotate this 90 degrees so that we have this back wall parallel to our sheet. Now, the reason why I'm rotating this is because when you're drawing floor plans, you ideally want everything to be either perpendicular or parallel to the sheet. Therefore, it makes it a lot easier to offset walls, to create much more accurate drawings that have straight lines. It's the worst thing, having wonky lines everywhere. It's really difficult to work with. So if you can choose a point of the sheet that you can kind of be parallel to, and that's the kind of base point of the drawing, then it just makes life a little bit easier when you're drawing the floor plan. So now we've rotated it, we have something like this, which just makes it a lot simpler to begin drawing some walls. Now that we have this all set up, the next thing is going to once again just lock these elements in the background. So we have them as a base to our drawing, and so as we draw our walls, things don't get moved or muddled up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select these components, right click them, click lock. I'm going to do the same with this lock and the same with the boundary lock. So therefore, as you can see, there are some components that need locking, but as you can see, if I draw anything or try to select anything, it's not going to move or adjust, which is what we want as a base. And I've done the same here for the upper levels and also a roof plan. And going down into the section, I've just elaborated a little bit further on the initial massing that we did in the previous lesson, just to give us a good basis now for beginning to draw up these walls and openings. So now that we have our base, we can now just essentially begin drawing walls. And we're going to create a new layer, heading over to the left hand side. I'm going to create layer, make sure the layer is active. And then now this is where the wall and opening tools become extremely powerful in Rayon. And I think this is a really easy and quick way to begin to start drawing floor plan sections and elevations. So if we head down to the bottom tab, you can see that here that we have these element components. We've briefly touched upon the zoning tool in the previous lesson, obviously outlining these zones. But the next element that we're going to talk about is the wall. So you can either do the shortcut of typing W, or you can head down, select the element wall. And what you'll find is as soon as you select the wall, on the right hand side here, you can then begin to change the wall thickness, the fill, and the stroke, very similarly to the way that we draw polylines or shapes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this wall thickness 0.3 as a kind of just a default wall for our project. I'm going to do the fill as a solid black, just because I like to have a nice strong contrast in my drawings and it gives it a good base to the drawings. So we're going to do it solid black, and then we therefore don't really need a stroke because the fill is black. Now the next thing we're going to do is simply head to our canvas and now begin drawing walls. So the first instance is going to be simply starting to trace the outline of our zones, and just outlining, making sure that we have everything perpendicular and straight. By holding shift, you can make sure that you're drawing straight lines. And when you start drawing some of these walls, some really useful tools to use are down here in the editing tools. So I've briefly touched upon trimming, I've touched upon joining and exploding, but some of the really useful tools to use when drawing walls is, for example, if I do this as an example, the extend tool is a really great tool. So you can select one wall, and if you want to extend another wall, you can come down, you can click extend, and it'll extend that wall for you. If you have two walls crossing like so, you can select one component that you want the item to be cut with. You can select that, head down to the bottom, click trim, and trim the wall of your choice. And then you can do the same for this one. If you select the item, type enter, it will do the same editing tool that you used previously. Select this, and therefore you've created a nice angle that is neat and tidy. Another great tool to use if you are looking to draw kind of parallel lines and making sure that you've got a kind of even distance between walls is you can come down once again, select your component, come down, and we can use the offset tool, which is a really great tool to make sure that everything's parallel, everything's perpendicular, and you can set the distance of the offset by typing the distance at the bottom here. So we could say maybe 5 meters, type enter, it'll give us a distance of 5 meters that is drawn. So now we've just simply drawn an outline around the zone. We're now going to start eating into the internal spaces and start just defining some of these spaces. So using the very same tool, heading over to the wall, we're going to use a much smaller kind of partition wall, which is going to be 0.1. I mean, these aren't majorly accurate, but this is just a kind of for diagram purposes currently. So for example, we can create a wall here along to define the garage zone. We can begin to define the office zone, and we'd also do the same process on the upper floor, and it's just a simple case of outlining all of the rooms. Now with some time and some work into the floor plans, you'll arrive at something like this, which has, as you can tell, you've got the outer shell of the property, and you've also got the internal partitions. Now, as you can see here, I've started to define or some extra kind of architectural features and responding to the surrounding landscape and kind of extending some of this geometry further out beyond the kind of shell of the building. And the reason why I've done this is because I'm trying to identify here that we could potentially have this slope, and we're trying to extend this maybe kind of retaining wall, which could be a feature of this kind of corner, this outdoor area here for the office. So we could create, maybe this could just be literally a stone wall that is kind of supporting that that landscape behind. And then on the top edge here, I've just extended this wall out ever so slightly, just to give some kind of geometry and language to the floor plan. Now, something that I like to do is I try to create some kind of edges and some extension to the geometry, try to make it a bit more interesting. And that's exactly what we're doing here by kind of implementing these features that are also useful to the kind of the separation between the public and private zones, and also to create these barriers between the landscape. And also one thing I've done here is I've highlighted a kind of opening space for the garage. So as you can see here, as you enter through the main road, you've got this kind of central point where you can drive your car straight into the garage. Now on this upper edge here, we have the WC, and I've identified that potentially you could have maybe a cloakroom as you enter the property here. So once again, you have this arrival space. The next stage would then to begin to start draw a stair. We then have obviously this link between the garage, the office, this external area for the office, and then this area here. And one thing I've done is I've indicated maybe a potential kind of fireplace or something, some kind of partition or column in the middle of the space, just to break up the space a little bit, because it's such a vast open space. You need to create some kind of partition, whether kind of fully or whether kind of transparent in this way, where you'd probably have two chimneys for a fireplace which you can look between, but it just creates some kind of division between the space and breaks up the space a little bit more. And on the upper floor, I've traced that lower level just to indicate some kind of roof. You can see here, this is where the chimneys arrive on the upper level. And I've identified here exactly from the zoning that as you arrive up this stair on the upper part here, you have a bedroom. You then have a secondary bedroom, a bathroom. You have an ensuite here at this back end, and also a walk-in wardrobe. So here you can very much tell that this is the master bedroom. Now, one thing that is useful to start doing at this stage is to kind of differentiate the back layer and the floor plan. So as you can see, you can still see the site plan in the distance in behind. Obviously, you shouldn't be able to see any of that. So what I'm going to do is simply just trace around the floor plan, and I'm going to create a white fill behind so that you can't see any of this landscape poking through. We'll fill that white and group it together. So now we have a base behind the drawing so that you can't now see the contours or anything behind kind of intruding on the internal space. Now, to switch our attentions very quickly to section elevation. So the two kind of section lines that I think are really interesting through this property is one almost slicing through here. So you have a kind of a slice through the upper volume as well as the lower volume, and then also a slice potentially perpendicular through this way. So we can take a slice through the landscape, you get an idea of the slope, and potentially maybe just shuffle this back slightly. Now, one thing that's really useful, which I will get into more detail in the next lesson, that is going to be the block library. So I'm going to very briefly touch on the block library now, and I'll go into more detail in the next lesson. But essentially, if you head over to the left-hand side, you will see this block tab. Now, if you select the block tab, you can head over to the libraries, and what you'll see is that there are thousands of blocks available. And I mean, I think there's 4,000 plus blocks available to use. But just to very kind of briefly touch upon the blocks that we're going to use for this section, if you head down, we've got a block type called title blocks and annotations. So if we select on title blocks and annotations, you will see that we have all kinds of different blocks that you can use and drop into your canvases to be able to add scale bars or section lines, or even a title block itself, elevation marks, viewpoints, etc. You pretty much got everything you could wish for in this library down here in this title blocks and annotation section. But what I'm going to use is I'm going to head up and type in, would do section. And what we want is the section head, which we can then customize and add more detail to this drawing. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop in this section head. So I'm just going to drag and drop it into my library, into my canvas, sorry. And as you can see, it arrives in like so, which you can then come into. You can change the color fill. We could change that to red if we wanted to. And all I'm going to do is simply rotate this in the direction that we're taking this section through. And I'm also going to change the type of the line stroke. So we're just going to maybe do a lighter and add a dash. And then an additional useful thing to add to this block is you can select into the block. You can head down to this text tool at the bottom. You can type in maybe if you want it to be section A or section B. You can then make this smaller by doing one type or maybe 0.5. Let's do 0.4 and rotating this so that it's in the right position, or maybe make that a bit smaller. And then you could do the same on the other end. and also across the drawing. And you'll arrive at something like this. I've also imported the other end of the section, so we've got the kind of direction of AA, got the direction of BB, and I've also added the east and south elevations because I think these are also the interesting or the points of interest for the project. So we have section AA, which is taking a kind of cross section through the site and indicating this upper level with the pitched roof. And then we have section BB, which is more of a long section through the long ways of the site. And you can see that we have this cantilever above the office area where we have this kind of outdoor space. And then we have the south elevation, so kind of looking at the property in the kind of southern direction, and the east elevation, which will be the kind of similar direction as this section here. So the next thing is going to be start adding some openings, so windows, doors, and also creating your own blocks, which you can drop into your models as instances. So first things first, if you head down to the bottom once again where you have your wall tool, where you have your zone tool, you also have an opening tool. So you can select the opening tool, and if you head over to the right hand side, it will come up with a active block, which if you select, you can head down and you can scroll into the libraries. You can see that they've got 93 different openings, which you can choose from. So if you scroll down, you can see that they've got all the different types of pivot doors, glass doors, revolving doors, you've got sliding doors, you've got bifold doors, you've got simple kind of sliding windows, you've got very simple kind of default windows. You've got 93 options to choose from. So now this is a process of dropping these windows into the walls, making sure the walls are kind of hosting the windows. So the first things first is I'm going to head down into this potential door. If you select the item, click select, what you'll see is you have the item active. And now as you can see, as I start dragging along some of these walls, it will be parallel to the wall and it will be hosted within the wall element. So if we wanted to have a door entrance like so, we would hover over the top, it would place it into the wall. And if you click, you'll get the opportunity to mirror it in any direction, so you can position it however you would like. Because we are opening inwards into the corridor, ideally we want it to be hung this way, and then you select again to place it. Now if you click escape, so you come out of the active block, you can then select your item, and over this right hand side you can see that you have all the different options of mirroring, modifying, rotating. You can change the layer, of course, so we want to make sure that we create an opening layer for this door. You can change the door definition, and you can choose the different members that are associated with that block. So most of the blocks in the block library also have alternative views available, which I will go into when we go back into the elevations and sections. So as you can see here, the same block has different view options. You can change the style, of course. You can change the fill of the swing, or you can change the thickness of thickness and color of the door details as you cut through them. You can change the opening offset. So if we wanted to do offset the wall by 5 meters, you can do. You can change the zone limits, and you can also change the size of the doors. So you can make a custom size. You could do a 1 meter door by 1 meter, and you can make that and change that and adjust it yourself, and it'll adjust the parameters for you. Now the way that I want this floor plan to work is, as you enter this opening space, I want this to be an arrival point, as I've mentioned in the previous lessons. I want this to be a point where you obviously have these options of moving in different directions, but you also have this sense of arrival and views over the landscape. So as you enter in this back kind of more public zone where you have the driveway, obviously it's quite a closed area because of the nature of the landscape. But as you enter through the space, I want there to be glazing that opens up these kind of views from the moment that you arrive into the property. I'm going to come down once again. I'm going to use the opening tool. I'm going to select the tool that I want to use. I'm going to go to blocks and openings, and I'm going to do a window. So with the window, you can place it in the floor plan very similarly to the window, very similarly to the door, sorry. And then once again, you can adjust the parameters. You can change the width to 5 meters if you wanted to, which is far too big. We'll maybe do a 2 meter wide window at this point. And the idea is that as you enter this space, you've got this point of arrival. And maybe it just needs to be a touch smaller. It doesn't need to be so thick. And this is going to be a case of me populating the drawings with these openings. You can begin to place different types of doors, bifold doors ideally in this zone here, because we have this access between the kind of dining, kitchen and living room, and we want that access into, so for example, let's do a bifold door. We'll place that into the model, and we want to do, for example, if we want to do multiple of them, we can select them in. Or if you wanted to do a sliding door instead, which might be a little bit more subtle, and we can be a bit more expansive with, we can make that bigger. Maybe we could do 2 sets of sliding doors, maybe one here and one here, like so. Additionally, if you couldn't find a block that you wanted to implement into the drawing and you wanted to create your own, you can do so. So one thing that I'm going to draw here is for this garage door, we could very simply use the polyline and create some kind of indication of a potential, I don't know, shutter or kind of door that's going to come down and land into place. We can add a bit more detail to it to show that there's going to be some kind of edge to it. We can then offset that edge by heading down into here and offset that by, I don't know, let's say we'd have a 50 mil edge. And likewise with the other side, if we copy that over by typing CC, and we'll drag and drop that into place. Now what you can do is, for example, if you wanted to create this as a block and have it as an instance that you can use throughout your project, you can select these items like so, head down to this bottom tab here, and you can select block. And what this will do is it will create a block, and you'll have a default. So when you create a new block, it creates a default block called block 1. When you head over to the block library on the left hand side, and you go to my blocks, you can see that block 1 is now available as an instance, and you can select that, you can drag it in, and as you can see, you can then begin to populate that in your drawings. So for example, if you had a window that you wanted to add to your drawings but there wasn't available in the Rayon library, you can create your own instance. You can import a CAD file and create a block in the same way by importing an item, selecting the polylines or objects or shapes, going down to the bottom, selecting block, and creating a block out of those components. And you can obviously change the name of the block by heading up to the top right hand corner, changing that to maybe garage door, and you now have that block in your block library, which you can populate across your drawings. And additionally, when creating your own blocks, you can change the insertion point so you can punch holes into walls. For example, if we take this block that we have just created and we click into it to edit, you will notice that there is this white point in the middle. Now, if we select that, that is technically the insertion point, and we head over to the right hand side and we change the insertion to a segment. And what you'll see is now you have 2 insertion points at either end of the block. So now that when you come out of the block and you drop it into a wall, it will cut into the wall, which is really great. So then you can start dragging and dropping it into walls. And after some time working into the floor plans, you'll arrive at something like this. So to very quickly describe my kind of logic, my thinking behind the openings in these areas. So upon arrival, we have this kind of big glazed space. So we have this arrival point, and you then have these direct views out over the landscape. But a note here is that I haven't gone full glazing at this point. I haven't gone kind of full expansive glazing. And instead I've got like a kind of poke through over the landscape to give you a bit of a kind of teaser of what the view is going to be like if you enter round into this space and you have all these glazed areas. So you've got this kind of opening area here with this kind of poke through over the landscape. And then when you enter these spaces here, of course, this is going to be a kitchen in this back end here with the kind of utility room. We're then going to have potentially a dining space here. And then we have this living zone here, which is divided by this chimney as we've described. And therefore we've got some sliding doors for access to this patio here off the dining room, and then more significant glazing on this end of the building where we have a living space, and potentially this kind of solid wall where we could have, I don't know, a TV or something, where you could have potentially seating around this zone. So we have some kind of solid and void zones where we have kind of glass openings, but then obviously some kind of feature walls just to break up the elevation and give it a bit of a composition. And then down this side here, we've got the office space with a nice window looking out over this landscape, which is kind of channeling your views over in that direction. So we've trying to not gone too expansive glazing, but also kind of channeling these views over the landscape. And on the upper level, we have, once again, the master bedroom at this end, a window out looking over from the bathroom. We have views when you're potentially lying in bed here, out over the landscape. And then we have this zone here, which we could begin to start playing with in a moment with a kind of stair configuration and how we could potentially create a feature of this stair space. And then on this end here, we've got some kind of windows poking through as well. So, and then when we quickly jump to the roof elevation, I've simply traced over those lower levels with some polylines, added a line through to show a pitched roof. And we've now got this quite strong geometry of this kind of these kind of different axes that are slicing through the site, and we have quite a strong language which I think reads quite nicely in roof plan. So the final component that we want to explore here before we dive into the sections and elevations is this stair. And so I'm going to start actually designing the stair from the upper level so we can see how we can begin to work into this space. And now how I envision this space is that we have a kind of double height atrium and then potentially kind of like a reading zone, a reading area, maybe a bookshelf on this upper level, potentially a little seat, maybe with a glass balustrade. So you get a kind of feature of this double height space and it becomes part of the interior and kind of the interior architecture. So what I was considering is that potentially depending on how deep the stair will need to be, we could potentially have the stair coming along here, which is perpendicular to that wall. And then we can maybe just have a bit of a language slicing through like so, where we create this double height zone here. This could then open up as a bit of a reading space depending on how much space we have here, which when we jump to the interior layouts, we can start testing the space that we have in this zone. So therefore we have a kind of void in this area, which I'm going to select as dashed grey. And then if we drop that down into the lower level, and so therefore we have obviously a door that we have to be sensitive at this point, and we have almost, as you enter in this space, you probably don't want to butt the stair right up to that back wall. Instead, we could have it maybe central, so we have a bit of a feature. So if we offset, potentially if we draw a line along here, we then offset that, so we probably want that to be 1.2 meters minimum really. If we drop that there, so there the stair could start there. And if we have a tread of, let's say a standard tread, we'll do offset again, which is 0.0 on the shortcut. We could do a standard tread of maybe 0.18, so 180 mil. And then we can just copy that across. So we start to get a stair. Can square that off. And potentially make it a bit narrower, it's a little bit too wide. And trim that down by typing TR, like so. And we can test the depth of that So let's make that 1 meter. So let's offset this by 1 meter, like so. And then we can extend that stair back out. And then we'll obviously start adding some more detailing with the balustrading, so we can also offset that with maybe a, let's say 100mm balustrading, so 0.1. Maybe we don't want 100mm, then that's quite thick. Maybe we'll go 0.05, so 50mm balustrade. And if we also indicate the cut at which the stair is being sliced through on the upper floor, we can get something like this. So the stair is a kind of floating element, which when we come to the upper level, it arrives with a nice kind of balcony with a glass balustrade in, which continues and wraps round. So we've got a bit of a kind of geometry, a bit of an expressive design language. And this could potentially become a kind of bookshelf or a reading zone. And it becomes quite a nice feature of the arrival point of the building. Now, if we switch our attentions to the sections and elevations, I'm going to develop these old school because we're working in 2D here and we want to make sure that we're drawing accurately. And this will be a process of going back and forth between the floor plans and elevations, as I've discussed. And so what I've done here is I've set up the two elevations, the east elevation and the south elevation. And you're probably wondering why I've rotated the plans in this way, and it's simply because I have aligned the elevations parallel with the elevation line, so we can begin to essentially projecting the floor plan onto this massing and begin to define where these windows are being placed in elevation, where these voids, where these walls are being placed. And likewise with the south elevation, we can begin to start marking up where these elevations, we can start marking up where these windows and openings are placed, and begin to work into it in elevation as well as plan. So the old school way of doing this is very simply setting up the floor plan so it's parallel to the elevation. And what we're going to do is we're going to start drawing polylines straight down from the floor plan to show the projection and the positionings of these features of the floor plan. So to begin with, we're going to hit this corner. We're going to hold down shift to make sure that we're drawing straight. And this is just going to be a case of then copying this over by clicking CC. And we're going to pick up on some of these elements that are defining the edges of windows or edges of walls. And we're just going to copy them into place like so. And this would just be a very crude way of identifying where these components are, so we can begin to understand in elevation how they're working. I mean, some of these components will be hidden in the landscape. So this is an elevation, obviously looking at the building kind of in section really. So some of these elements would be embedded into the landscape. And then obviously we'd have to do the same on the upper level in order to get the kind of language at this level. So now using this mass, I'm just going to adjust it slightly, and we're going to trim that there by typing TR once again. Now this will be a process of then selecting your shape of the mass, typing TR or going to the trim editing tool and just begin cutting down these polylines. So we can begin to identify, okay, so we've got some sliding doors here, as you can see. We have a pocket window here, and we can then start looking in elevation of how high these windows are and how much, whether they're floor to ceiling or whether they're kind of small kind of pockets into the elevation that are poking through. And of course, this is our massing, so we can begin to just adjust the massing slightly, as this won't be accurate, as this was a kind of sketch, an initial sketch to begin with. And for example, in this instance where we have this fill here, we can then instead use the polyline through to indicate where this wall extends through. Now to show you how you can use the windows in elevation, you can come over to the left hand side, enter the block library, head over to the libraries, and what I'm going to do is a very quick way of doing it is just type in window. And what you can see is all of the blocks that have a purple tag, as you can see here, these have all got purple tags. If you select the purple tag, you'll be able to see that they have a plan member, a section member, and an elevation member, which is really useful. So if you can head over to your plan and you can see what item that you have used. So for example, this one, we have a bypass sliding door. You can then select that bypass sliding door, drag and drop it into your elevation. And as you can see, that will land into your elevation like so. And then you can position that in place to make sure that your openings in both plan and elevation are matching. Now, this is obviously, once again, completely up to you whether you do this in this way or whether you want to create your own blocks. So in the same way that we showed in plan how to create your own blocks, you can also do the same in elevation by selecting rectangle tool, for example. If you wanted to create your own detail, which you could then offset, for example. So if we offset that by, say, 50 mil, and then you can create your own window detail by right clicking or heading down to this bottom tab here, click block, and then create window type 1, for example. So I'm not going to bore you through the process of adding all these windows and drawing everything in elevation and section, but the principles is that I'm projecting the floor plans down onto the elevations to arrive at something like this, where we have some openings identified. I have done these all as my own blocks just because I wanted that flexibility and freedom to be able to draw the windows and doors myself to get the kind of geometries correct. I've identified a chimney at the top here. You can see the pitched roof now, and we've designed the window to match that pitched roof. And as you can see, we've got a kind of language where we have some floor to ceiling height doors and windows, and then some kind of moments of where we're just poking into the elevation. And that is just to provide some variety and to give that kind of contemporary feel to the barn style. And we got this back end of the garage space embedded into the landscape, as you can see. Now, slicing through the other way, once again, we have our window blocks that I've created, and I've created kind of different varieties. So we have window block 2, for example, and some of them I've kind of pushed and pulled for these areas here. And we have kind of a very kind of vertical language on the upper level, because we have these very long horizontal voids and masses that are kind of sat on top of each other. I've then added kind of long vertical elements to be able to kind of break that rhythm slightly and to create that design language and the contrast between the two. If we had a lot of horizontal elements, then it can become quite kind of a very prominent feature of the elevation. Now in section, the same applies with drawing the elevation and adding the kind of window groups. But in section, what we have done, instead of drawing them as polylines, is we've used the wall tool, identified the thickness of the wall, which is 0.3, and then we created once again our own openings and worked that into the section in order to give a good understanding of where these windows are placed and located. And as you can see here, we've got this double height space where the stair is making its way up into that landing space here, which is going to have kind of glazed balustrading when we go into the next lesson. And likewise down here, you can see that is this kind of double height space. So in lesson 7, there's quite a lot of detail there that are beginning to understand how we can use these wall and opening features and all of the kind of blocks that we have available in the library. We've begun to identify the kind of wall partitions and the breakdown of these spaces and what is actually going to happen in these zones, adding some details for the stairs, for example, using polylines. And then obviously, of course, adding all of the windows and openings to be able to identify the kind of environments and the atmospheres that we want to create in these spaces. Obviously, creating more expansive openings and relationships between the landscape in this end of the building, where this becomes a bit more private out the back, creating our own blocks for openings, etc., both in plan and in elevation and section. So I hope that gives you a good understanding of how we use openings and draw walls. It is quite a process in section and elevation to kind of draw and project down the floor plans. And now moving forward, we're going to start populating the drawings with furniture using the block library, going in a bit more detail into all of the blocks that we have available and giving you a good understanding of what the best blocks are for you to use and how you can use them to the best of your ability to add to your drawings and add the detail that you require.